Good evening. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm Rebecca Cinderbrand. I'm the director of the Georgetown Journalism Program here at the college. The past few days have provided us with multiple opportunities for some of us to reflect here on the Hilltop on all the ways that this profession can be a force for good in the world, and this university's commitment to supporting those efforts. Last night, the journalism program hosted an advanced screening of the upcoming major motion picture, She Said, spotlighting the tireless reporting efforts of my former Georgetown undergraduate classmate, Megan Twohey. And at this point, it's no spoiler to say that her work to hold the powerful to account, give voice to the voiceless, and help spark changes to the workplace, to society, to culture, the effects of which are still being felt today, both in the US and beyond. That work also helped the New York Times earn a well-deserved Pulitzer Prize for public service in 2018. That fundamental idea of this profession as witness, as sustainer of the community, as a vehicle for exposing injustice and facilitating positive change, that's been a foundational principle throughout the long tradition of journalism education here at Georgetown, even predating our program itself. It's defined the life's work of Georgetown-trained journalists, such as Megan, such as Austin Tice, unjustly detained, and while covering the human impact of the conflict in Syria, and still missing, but very much not forgotten a decade later. And countless other alumni bravely reporting from throughout the country and around the world. And it's the driving spirit behind the conversation we're here to learn from tonight. The mission of spotlighting not just wrongdoers, but good actors and individuals working to bring about a just and better world. Journalism bearing witness to the full spectrum of humanity's capacity to effect change. Before all that gets underway, I just wanted to briefly share some well-deserved thanks. Thank you to the Berkeley Center for inviting me and for hosting this event, as well as the rest of the fantastic journalism guests and programming you bring to campus every year in partnership with the Pulitzer Center, spotlighting the complexities and nuances of the religious elements driving both many international crises and solutions, with the idea that greater understanding and engagement can help to foster a better, more peaceful world. Thank you to the Pulitzer Center for your continued collaboration in sponsoring tonight's event, as well as the student luncheon earlier today with Fred and Paul. Thanks to Berkeley Center's senior fellow, Paul Eli, for leading this conversation tonight. As many of you already know, Paul is also the director of the American Pilgrimage Project, a university partnership with StoryCorps, based in the Berkeley Center. His work deals primarily with the ways religious ideas are given expression in literature, the arts, music, and culture in the broadest sense. And of course, thanks to our guest of honor, Fred Bahnsen, who brings a lifetime of experience and expertise to this subject. From his childhood as a missionary kid in Nigeria, to his later interest in monastic spirituality, to his illustrious career as a religion journalist and a Pulitzer Center grantee. Tonight, we'll hear more about his most recent work, along with other profiles on monastic figures and the contemplative life, including an exploration of what it means to embrace the idea of journalism as witness in a secular world. And finally, thanks to all of you for coming tonight for what's sure to be a fascinating and very important conversation. Paul, take it away.
Thank you very much. As Professor Cinderbrand indicated, I'm based in the Berkeley Center, and I'm a relative newcomer to the journalism program. I taught in the program last spring, and I'll be teaching again this spring. And to me, it's deeply satisfying to be involved in the journalism program and to kind of enter late and through the back door. In a sense, maybe it's satisfying because that's the way I entered journalism. I did a fair amount of writing around, but a lot of my journalist experience has followed on the experience of writing a couple of long books. Life You Saved May Be Your Own, Group Portrait of 4 American Catholic Writers from 2003, and then a book called Reinventing Bach from 2012. And that, I'm mentioning that because it was through my books and through my work in publishing that I came to know Fred Bahnsen. And as our conversation develops, we can explore where things went. But can you, just by way of introducing yourself, can you tell the people here about your first book, Soil and Sacrament, about how it put us in touch with each other?
Yeah, well, first I just want to say good evening, everyone. And thanks to the Pulitzer Center and Holly for arranging this, and Ryan and Imogene and everyone at the Berkeley Center for this partnership, and really grateful to be among you. Looking forward to our conversation tonight. How did I get started with Soil and Sacrament? And yeah, I think that book in particular really helped me figure out the kind of journalism that I want to do, which is sort of first-person narrative reporting and placing myself in the story as the eye for the reader. And I've done more sort of more straightforward sort of reportage without myself in the story. But I think that book was really where I began to feel my way into how you become an immersion journalist, how you become a narrative writer writing about true people and events. And the self becomes simply the reader's eye. You're there as the one doing the witnessing for the reader. And we were talking earlier at lunch today, the image I have of the writer's role comes from my friend and mentor, Barry Lopez, who we'll talk about at some point tonight. And Barry, National Book Award winning author of Arctic Dreams and many other books, also another writer who was not a trained journalist, but who did a lot of journalistic immersion reporting. He used the image of one who's sort of standing beside the reader with his hand on the reader's back, sort of standing side by side, but looking out at what he wanted to show the reader. And there's a kind of companionable sense to that gesture that I've always resonated with. You're not the one out front of the reader. You're not the one who's lecturing to the reader. You're the one who's the reader's companion on this journey that you're both on, and you're both learning together. And so that's kind of a stance that I've tried to adopt in my own journalism.
So with this first work of immersion reporting, let's say, Soil and Sacrament, what was it you were immersed in, and where were you trying to accompany the reader with that work?
Yeah. So Soil and Sacrament was it was a story of the food and faith movement. So back in 2005, 2006, with Michael Pollan's book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, some of you probably remember that. There was kind of the rise of the sort of sustainable food movement in the U.S. and people kind of coming back to this understanding of where does our food come from? How can I reconnect with the land through food? Michael Pollan quoted Wendell Berry's famous line, "Eating is an agricultural act." And so really making that connection between the way we eat and how food is grown. And so I wanted to tell that story, but tell it through the lens of different faith communities who were engaging in agriculture. And so these faith communities really coming back to more of a sort of rooted, grounded understanding of their faith. And so I visited 4 different faith communities, a group of Trappist monks in South Carolina who grew mushrooms, not those kind of mushrooms, but the legal kind. And a group of Protestant community gardeners in the mountains of North Carolina, a group of Pentecostal farmers in the Skagit Valley of Washington, and a group of Jewish farmers in Connecticut, in Western Connecticut. And in each place, I sort of went as a participant observer and just dropped myself in, participated in the farming and milking goats, in making kimchi, whatever was happening on the farm, in the garden, and then trying to write about that and trying to reflect on, for example, with the Jewish community, why, what difference it makes to consider the Jewish Shemitah, the 7-year fallow period when Jews were commanded to let the land lie fallow in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. What does that mean on a working Jewish farm, right? And so how do you interpret the letter of the law, the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law? So those were kind of the questions that I brought, sort of how that act of growing food changes the way people think about their beliefs.
It's one of the paradoxes of long-form nonfiction writing, especially the kind that's published in national magazines, that having a book then opens the door for shorter work. That was my experience. And so after Soil and Sacrament, you found your way in to Harper's with a piece called The Priests and the Trees, and then into Emergence magazine with a piece that involved you following the trail of Thomas Merton on his Western American journey that he took in what turned out to be the last year of his life in 1968. And those pieces, both of which they're a very, very strong work that had a powerful effect on me, thinking about them now, I think about them in terms of the conversation we're having. Participant observer isn't quite adequate to what's going on in those pieces and the ones that followed. You go to a place that is spiritually loaded. You identify strongly with a person who takes some sort of sacred point of entry into that place, and then you wind it back to your own experience where you and that person are kind of witnessing together. Is that a fair account of what's going on in those pieces? And can you, if so, fill us in?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think this is part of what I've been learning and trying to figure out as a journalist, how to write about religious figures, and while acknowledging my own religious questions, preoccupations, the religious commitments and practices that I bring to the story, how to sort of name those in a way, or at least signal to the reader that I have something at stake here. I'm not just a distanced, objective, quote unquote, journalist. And I think that's the whole thing about objective journalism, I think is a myth that we bought into. I think we all have some kind of subjectivity that we do our reporting from. The question is how we claim that for the reader or somehow acknowledge that. And so in my own case, writing about different religious figures like Thomas Merton, famous Trappist monk, who Paul's written beautifully about in The Life You Save May Be Your Own. If you haven't read that book, you need to go out and get it tonight. It's a fantastic book with Merton and Dorothy Day and Walker Percy and Flannery O'Connor, a sort of quad biography. But writing about figures like that, and then Father Columbus Stewart, who I profiled in the piece that you hold in your hands, I have to be honest with the reader about my own preoccupations, my own kind of questions that I bring, but yet do that in a way that's inviting to non-religious readers. And I think we were talking about this at lunch today, I think that's the kind of writerly challenge that I enjoy is writing about religion in a way that is not confessional per se, that's not making a theological argument, but that is bringing the reader into the world of someone with a religious story, someone with religious commitments, and then saying, look, what do you think of this? And bringing my own questions in as well. And to me, it's an endlessly fascinating challenge as a writer, how you do that. And I can't confess to I don't think it's something you can ever master. I think it's more of a set of questions that you bring. Yeah.
Flannery O'Connor said somewhere, or wrote, that the challenge, and she wrote of the novelist, she really meant the fiction writer, and she meant herself, is the challenge for the novelist is to make belief, the novelist with Christian preoccupations, I think she said, is to make belief believable. So, in some respects, 2 generations ago, that's what Thomas Merton did for so many people. he was a kind of surrogate for seekers who found religion credible in his account as they might not have otherwise. And then some kind of similar operation is going on in your work, I suppose. So let's just take the piece that's on the chairs here. It's a piece about a Benedictine monk who has made a life's work and a calling of traveling to distant places and arranging for the protection or digitization of ancient religious manuscripts in all sorts of languages that are may go out of existence because they're in places of conflict and places where crisis reporting is required, and that's the Pulitzer connection here. So this figure, some people compare him to like an Indiana Jones figure. You make him a figure in whom belief is believable, that you can see why this would be a calling and why he would follow the trail of these manuscripts even when they're not manuscripts of his own faith. I mean, how intentional is that? Do you say, I'm going to make Columba Stewart a figure in whom belief can be made believable, or is it just emerged by the by?
Yeah, I think it comes out of the story that I'm trying to tell. And so just a little background on this piece. So Father Columba Stewart is a Benedictine monk at St. John's Abbey in Minnesota. He gave the prestigious Jefferson Lecture in 2019 here in Washington, and he spoke here at Georgetown, a couple months ago, last year?
Just about a year ago.
A year ago, okay. Yeah, and I met Columba through a mutual friend, and I was visiting St. John's Abbey at the time, I don't know, 2 years ago, and he was sort of my tour guide thanks to this mutual friend we had. And as I started learning about his work, he's like, outwardly just another Benedictine monk in a way.
What's
in his
a Benedictine monk like outwardly?
And what is a Benedictine monk? Yeah. Black habit, in his case, very closely cropped monkish head and spectacles, in his mid-60s, soft-spoken, quiet, contemplative bearing. Come to find out, his degrees from Yale and Harvard and Oxford, and he's an expert in 5 or 6 ancient languages, and is one of the noted historians of monastic Christianity. In addition to being someone who travels the world on a regular basis preserving manuscripts. And I was just fascinated as we were talking. And these are the kind of people you meet in monasteries. If you hang out in monasteries like I do, I just kind of go hang out with monks. I really love monks. And nuns. And if you hang out in these places, you meet people like that who are just like, who would be a tenured professor or a doctor or just, experts in their field if they were out in kind of normal life, but they're leading these quiet, cloistered, monastic lives. And Father Columba was one of those people. And so I was really just fascinated with him as a person. And I thought this would make a great story to just follow him around and figure out what he does and why he does it and what are his motivations for doing it. And I was really intrigued with the tension I saw between a rooted, grounded life as a monastic, right? You take vows of stability to a place, to a single community. You can't just be a gyrovague and cruise around whenever you want to. You have to be committed to that place and that community. And yet he was traveling, every couple months to Syria or to Baghdad or to Afghanistan, Nepal, and then also recently Mali. For the past 4 or 5 years, he's been going to Mali in West Africa. And so I was intrigued with that tension. I was also intrigued with, here's this guy, a Christian monk, committed to the 1,500-year-old Benedictine tradition of Christian monasticism, and yet he's going and risking his life to save Islamic manuscripts. he's going and meeting with Sufi scholars in Mali and helping them digitize their 12th century texts. Why? Right? What's his motivation for doing that? So that was enough to get me to write a pitch and send it to my editor and go and send the pitch to the Pulitzer Center and have them graciously give me the money to go. So that was kind of the motivation for the trip. And what happened in the story, you'll have to read more about that, but we can talk about some of that as well.
You make it sound so easy. I mean, how did you get Harper's and the Pulitzer folks to go for this? What can you clue us into what the pitch sounded like, or how did you present the story in a few sentences?
Yeah, that's a great question. I did it more than a few sentences. I wrote probably a good page and a half pitch, which I then reworked and crafted, and I talked it through with my editor, Chris Beha at Harper's, and he was really intrigued. And one of the questions I remember was, well, what about other people telling this story? He'd had a few pieces written about him in, I think, the Smithsonian, a few other places, but those were more kind of what he called the Indiana Jones stories, the kind of the daring monk off, on his mission. They were a little more surface level. They didn't kind of really get into the psychology, the motivations of his work, and nor did they get into the monastic spirituality component, which I thought was really important. And so that was kind of the differentiating factor that I pitched to Chris. And I had done several pieces with Harper's before, so there was a rapport. So I guess there was a certain trust that they placed in me, and so that was enough to send me.
So Beha, who's the editor of Harper's, is Jesuit educated. He went to Regis High School in Manhattan. The editors I've worked with have also been, many of them, fluent in Catholic stuff with various aspects of Catholic background in their families and so forth, kind of giving the lie to the idea that there's this hostile mainstream media that could give a hoot about religion and couldn't get it right even if it cared. I mean, what's your experience of that?
Yeah, I have not experienced that sort of hostility toward religion in the New York media. I think it just depends on how you're telling the story. And I think this is something that, having grown up myself in a certain kind of evangelical Christian culture, leaving that culture, going to divinity school at Duke Divinity, being trained in sort of theological arguments and Christian history and so on. There's a certain way of writing about Christianity that is very insiderish, and it's very cliquish almost, and just there's a lot of assumptions that get made when you're writing just for a Christian audience. And to a certain extent, that's true of any human community and any human or any religious tradition. There's things that are written for that community and things that are written for everyone. And I wanted to really try to write for a general audience and really write for anyone who was interested in these figures that I was profiling, Father Columbus Stewart or Stephen Blackmer, the priest in the trees profile, who is an Episcopal priest whose church is a 106-acre tract of woods in New Hampshire. I profiled him. But the trick is to make those people come alive as people first, and then their different religious commitments come into that. But I think the temptation to avoid is really writing for an insider audience, rather than a general readership. Yeah.
How about your personal search? I mean, the pieces that we're talking about, Profile of Stewart, has a whole middle section involving your experience in Africa in a kind of monastic situation. Your profile of Richard Rohr, the founder of the Center for Action and Contemplation, is born out of your own wish for an American Christianity with more interiority. you like to hang out in monasteries. You're on the trail of Merton, and we're kind of in the room with you on silent retreat for a few days. Is that a literary device, or how important is it that you are yourself working out these questions through the pieces?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think the literary device is what I was talking about earlier. The I in the story is really a stand-in for the reader, and you're bringing yourself in very sparingly in terms of personal details, but you're not writing about, like, so when I'm writing a story, when I went and profiled Thomas Merton, for example, I followed him around as he journeyed out west.
He had been dead since 1968, but he left an extensive journal in such a way that you could follow his tracks.
Right. So he had this short little journal, Wood Shore Desert, that basically gave me an itinerary of his trip over a period of 3 weeks. And in May of 1968, he did this trip out to the Redwoods Monastery in California, to Christ in the Desert Monastery, another Benedictine monastery in Abiquiu, New Mexico. And he also visited City Lights Books in San Francisco and drank wine with Lawrence Ferlinghetti, the Beat Poets. And so all of his trip was sort of laid out in his journals. And I thought, this was coming up, this was in, a few months before May of 2018. And I thought, there's a 50-year anniversary here. I'll go and just repeat his trip and write about it. And so the story kind of, there was a natural structure there. I just follow more or less his trip and write about the people I meet, pull his journals into that. And so the I that I brought into that piece was simply sending myself on this journey. And I actually brought a good friend of mine who's a filmmaker along with me, and he made a beautiful short 10-minute documentary. But as I wrote about in the piece, I was really there to help the reader get to know Thomas Merton and get to know the writings, get to know him through the people that I interviewed. And so I brought a little of my story in, but it was just enough so that you knew why I was on this journey. And for me, a deep connection I have with Merton is that we both were sort of victims of boarding school trauma. Neither of us were abused. It was more of just neglect. And as I read in his amazing book, Seven Storey Mountain, he was sent to a French boarding school for a number of years after his mother died, and his father was kind of a bohemian artist. And he was sent to this French boarding school, and he hated it. It was awful. And I was sent to a missionary boarding school in Nigeria, and likewise, hated it. It was awful. And so we had that connection, and so I brought that piece in. But that was just enough biographical detail to give me that emotional connection to my subject. And then the piece is really about Merton and the people that he meets, or that he knew back in the day. One of those was a nun, Sister Godelieve at Redwoods Abbey. And I remember speaking with Sister Godelieve, and we were I was taking notes for the piece I was writing. Jeremy had his camera, and he was interviewing for the film he was making. We're kind of both telling the same story with our different mediums. And we were interviewing her, and she went off on this dream that she had about Thomas Merton. And Sister Godelieve was from Belgium and had this wonderful Flemish burl of an accent. And 50 years later, she's still dreaming about Thomas Merton, who she met in 1968. And she told me this wonderful dream. She said we couldn't use this in the piece, but she's since passed on, so I feel free to convey this to you now. She dreamed she was in a ballroom, and the Pope was there, Thomas Merton was there. She was sitting next to the Pope, and then Thomas Merton came over and asked her to dance. And they danced across the ballroom. It was all very chaste and nun-like and very sweet. Anyway, that was one of the little glimpses I got into the power of this figure, to the fact that she's still thinking about him 50 years later, after meeting him at the monastery. He had that effect on a lot of people, and I think that's what I wanted to try to capture in the piece.
I'm going to stick with the self for a bit, because I haven't really used the self too much in my own work. My first book is a 542 pages with notes, and on about page 495, I used the first person I for the first time, feeling that I had to kind of earn that, to step into my own story at a certain point, but I had to earn it. But so for me, making belief believable has been about style. Like, let me make this book so beautiful and so shapely and so propulsive in its narrative and dexterous in its point of view that this stuff won't seem like nuts to people. And you've done, your pieces are elegant and structurally ingenious and so forth, but you've also just put yourself in there like as a person that for you the monastic experience is made credible through your account of it, so that then you're a kind of surrogate for the reader, and the reader witnesses through you in dark times for a lot of American religion, let's say, some people for whom these traditions are sources of life. Is that that's what I take away from it? Is that a strategy, or using the self in that way to engage the reader?
I think so. Yeah, I think I haven't thought about it that way, but I think one of the reasons I'm drawn to monastic Christianity as a subject, aside from just my own preoccupations with that form of belief and practice, is that it's such a radically different way of kind of doing religion, that most people don't have access to other than through caricature. And it's so easily caricatured or stereotyped of, the monk or nun as just someone who withdraws from the world and they're navel-gazing or whatever. I mean, we have all these stereotypes about what monastic people do over there in their little enclaves. And I kind of wanted to break that open a little bit and bring the reader in and show them just as normal people in some ways who have made a very distinctive life choice. And the more time I spent at monasteries, the more that became true, that in that they are people with just really fascinating life stories. In Soil and Sacrament, I told the story of Mepkin Abbey, this group of Trappist monks in South Carolina who grew oyster mushrooms. And just hearing the different life stories of these monks, one of them a young man, Brother Dismas, who joined the monastery at age 17, and he ended up leaving. He'd been there 7 years when I visited. He ended up leaving a few months after I visited. And I learned later that he felt he was no longer called to the celibate life. And as he was meeting with his brothers in the chapter room, and they were all gathered around, the way he put it to them is, as to why he was leaving, he said, "I want to take a brunette out for coffee. I want to take a brunette out for coffee." And one of the older monks came up after the meeting and he said, Brother Dismas laid a firm hand on his shoulder. He said, "Don't limit yourself to brunettes." Good monastic wisdom there. So he left, and he's now, a school teacher, I think. But just those life stories, I think, is part of what I wanted to capture in these different monastic stories. Father Columba, I found a tougher nut to crack. Because he's such an intimidating guy intellectually. Like, not that he puts off that vibe, but I mean, he reads 4 or 5 ancient languages, and he's a Jefferson lecturer. I mean, that's like one of the highest awards in the country. I think it is the highest award in the humanities.
From the government, anyway. Yeah. From
the government, yeah. And even following him in Mali, there's a certain reserve that he not put up, it's just part of his bearing. And so that's a writerly challenge, right? Is how you kind of get inside someone's head and make them come alive as a character. He was tougher to do that with, but not in a way. He wasn't wasn't withdrawn. It was more of a monastic reserve, I would say. But again, that's, I think, a good challenge to help someone like that come alive for the reader.
I still want to talk about you, though.
Yeah.
So I mean, you and I have known each other for 15 years. I've been to your home in North Carolina, incredible farm around it. Your wife's a bluegrass musician. Your sons you've gone on the balls with my sons. When I call you and you're in Montana, you're taking them skiing. You're a father of 3. You are a lover of family life. And yet you've got this monastic yearning for the contemplative life that won't let you go. And a lot of the drama in the pieces has to do with the fact that you're a credible witness for the monastic desire, precisely because you don't fit the category in so many other ways. I mean, this thing just won't let you go. I mean, is my characterization of you as a black diamond skier, father, permaculture farmer, and bon vivant fair, and then the monastic thing is there besides, or how does it all fit together?
Yeah, that's. I feel like I'm on the couch up here.
No. That's why part of the power of the pieces is your credibility is because you've got all that other stuff going on.
Yeah, totally. And this is great because Paul and I have known each other for, as you said, about 15 years. And in some ways, we've been sort of trying to figure out, how you balance the life of, we both have 3 boys, with the writer's life, with the life of religious preoccupations. And I think for me, the monastic draw very much is in tension with being a father. I mean, some days my interest in monasticism is like, I just want to get the hell away from my kids and go somewhere to a monastery and retreat. But yeah, I do live a very active life. I'm a skier, a mountain biker, trail runner. I do a lot of just outdoor stuff, having grown up in Montana. And I'll be going back tomorrow to, 15-degree weather and a foot of snow on the ground. And so it's a very active life. And in a way that perhaps creates the necessity for reflection and withdrawal so that you're not just living day to day, but you're taking time to pull back. And so for me, the monastic preoccupation, well, this is something that I write about in this Harper's piece. It really came out of, I think, an early encounter with solitude. So solitude and silence are big in the monastic way of life.
This is at the boarding school. Yeah.
So yeah, as I write about in the piece, my years living in a boarding school in Nigeria as a missionary kid, with a set of house parents who were very distant and cold. They were kind of, in some ways, the quintessential dour Calvinists. It was a Calvinist Dutch Reformed church that my parents were missionaries with. And there was a kind of coldness there, different than a monastic reserve, more of just kind of a plain old meanness. And as a 10-year-old kid, when those people, when you're presented with that as your parental structure or role models, you have a number of options. My choice was to go inward and to begin exploring what prayer means. And so for me, that was an early encounter with prayer. Moving from what I call the just wanna prayer, in evangelical land, Lord, I just want to thank you. I just want to ask you. There's a lot of just want to asking for stuff. But this was more of a sort of encounter with silence and an encounter with listening as a mode of religious practice, I guess. And so I think that early experience was an attunement that drove the later interest in writing about monastic spirituality and monastic figures, yeah. I want to ask you a question before we get too far.
Okay.
I'm going to flip the script here. So I was telling a few of you at lunch, when I was pitching my book, Soil and Sacrament, when my agent was pitching my book, Soil and Sacrament, I had the idea of the book proposal, a sample chapter, and we were sort of going down the list of publishers of who we'd like to try to send this to. And I had read Paul's book, The Life You Saved May Be Your Own. We'd never met. And I said, well, let's send it to Paul Ely. Like, he would be my ideal editor. And we did. And Paul at the time was about to come here. He couldn't say that at the time, but he was being courted to come and teach at Georgetown. So he couldn't make a bid on my book, and I was so disappointed that I didn't get to work with Paul as an editor. And I was like, man, was there something wrong with my book? Or like, why did he pass? And later I learned that he was on his way to Georgetown. But all that's to say, we've had this kind of back and forth conversation over the years about our work. And I've always been really curious to ask you this, but you're a writer, but you're also an amazing editor. Like, how do you think of those two vocations in a way? Is there something you miss about being an editor? Is there a different mindset that you kick into when you're in editing mode versus editing your own work? I'm curious how you think of those two, the writer-editor vocations.
Well, so I worked at a firm called Farrar, Straus & Giroux for about 18 years, an amazing place. That was my postdoc and doc and master's and Fulbright all together. And Georgetown is a kindred place in the minds and talent that are walking around. But there was a passivity to publishing that was kind of amazing. At that place, you could just be sitting there, and Seamus would walk in, or Joseph Brodsky would call, or Tom Wolfe would ask you what you thought of his last chapter, and on a daily basis. Or there's a hurricane, and who am I stuck with but Ian Fraser, the great New Yorker writer, who we huddled in my office for a few hours waiting for the storm to pass. And there's Grace Paley, and there's Susan Sontag, and Michael Cunningham left his address book behind, and could you bring it to me? And all you had to do was show up, and these people will kind of walk in, and that's the only thing I miss about it, really. Because the satisfaction of having a writer's life in the way that I've been able to have at Georgetown, I was going to have a nervous breakdown with 3 young kids and a full-time job and journalism and books, and we were homeschooling, and there was a recession on, and I was teaching at Columbia at night. Crazy. But what I took away from the experience, I think, was a sense of literary work of any length as a live thing. That it's not Tinker Toys or an erector set. It's not moving parts that you can just take apart and put together in different ways. That's an aspect of editing, but the wish is for a live work, and the role of the editor is to give the writer of the live work a chance to make it kind of fully alive through encounter with the public, and then do the things that you can do along the way, paradoxically, to make it kind of more alive than it was. And it's an astonishing experience, which I had many times, to watch books become kind of more themselves and more the author's work through the intervention of the editor. You'd think, like, the more work I do as an editor, the less it's so-and-so's book. But my experience was the opposite, that it would become more distinctively theirs and more alive through the right kind of attention in editing. Trim this, shift this. My colleague Lawrence Stein was praised by one of his authors for his super important intervention 350 pages into this guy's book, where Lauren put, or manuscript, snooze in here. And that was his way of indicating that section needed something different going on in it. Snooze in here. I was never that harsh. So then I've tried to kind of keep that quality in my own writing. I nearly lost the book that I'm writing now, which is now 10/11ths done. It's about 125,000 words now, and I'm very excited about it. I think it's really going, but I almost lost it. And the pandemic kind of gave the book back to me, because I've just, since that pandemic happened, I've written every morning pretty much without fail for 90 minutes or so, which I couldn't do. I had too many other obligations, and I just said, I'm going to get this book back because I'm going to put it first, literally. And then I said to myself, how can I get this book back? It's like, and I hope this doesn't sound selfish. I said, I've kind of given to others some editing insights. Now I got to be my own. I got to kind of be my own editor, and all the stuff that I was telling others, I now got to turn back on myself and try to make my own book live and tell myself when I'm snoozing here. And the reader will be the judge, but I feel from the writer's point of view that I've gotten a second chance with this book, and I'm just full of gratitude at this point that it's there and it's nearly done and it's way better than it was going to be because of this self-editing, if you will.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. I've always wondered about that. I've read a few of the chapters in as Paul's been writing it. I think a couple of years ago now. I read some of the very early pieces, and I really
drastically changed.
Really excited to see where it's going. Really excited. Should we open up a little bit for Q&A?
Questions?
Yeah.
John.
Yes. Well, thank you. I'm John Borelli. I'm here in Georgetown, and I too hung around a lot of monasteries. In fact, I even had Brother Patrick Hart at Gethsemane say, "Would you like to come and stay in the Hermitage?"
Yeah. Wow.
To which my wife said, "Don't you dare without me," and leave me with the three children. So, but at St. John's, a lot of time I've spent at St. John's, Minnesota. So I want to ask you, with your background, were you tempted to explore the great novelists associated with St. John's? And I'm not talking about the Catholic James F. Powers, but somebody out of your own side of things, Kathleen Norris, who fell in love with St. John's.
Right. Yeah, I met Kathleen back in April at a faith and film conference in Texas, and we got to talk a little bit about St. John's. Yeah, and her book Dakota was very formative for me as a writer. I love her work. Yeah, she's great.
It's a book that is set at a monastery in southern North Dakota.
Minnesota, St. John's, or no, the one Dakota is in North Dakota. Yeah.
And it draws an analogy between the monastic life and the supposedly empty life of the plains, and winds the monastic tradition back to its origins in the desert, and makes the flyover country of the plains a place of monastic wonder in totally winning and persuasive ways.
Yeah. As you were talking too about you're almost getting to visit Merton's Hermitage, maybe you'll still go at some point, but in one of the stories that I wrote about Father Richard Rohr, the Franciscan priest who I profiled in another Harper's article on contemplative Christianity, he was telling me that he visited Merton's Hermitage I think back in the 80s or 90s, something like that, and he noticed some of Merton's books sitting on a shelf, and he went over and he found a copy of Seven Storey Mountain, and he realized it was Merton's own personal copy just sitting there in the Hermitage. And he ripped the cover off, and he took it home and he framed it, and on the back he wrote, "May God forgive me for this act of holy thievery."
And it was still there when you saw him in New Mexico?
It was hanging on his wall when I interviewed him in New Mexico. This is a Franciscan, and he's kind of got that rascally bit of rascally way about him, the kind of trickster. But that's what reminded me of that as you were talking about Merton's Hermitage.
He has pretty advanced cancer now, so let's keep him in our thoughts too, Father Rohr. In the back, and then David.
Yeah, hello. My name is Milana. I am a Chechen journalist from Russia, and I would like to ask you. You mentioned that you had some emotional connection with your character, if I can call him character. There is some, like as you know, like in in a journalistic world, there is some, discussion if we can have, or we can't have this emotional connection with our, I don't know, the people with whom we are talking. I'm sorry for my English. And I just wanted to ask you, did it help you when you were writing this book, or sometimes you found yourself thinking, okay, maybe this connection are too strong and I need to, to look more objectively on this situation, or not? It's just like I'm always thinking about it, and you just mentioned that's why I'm asking. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that came up today at lunch. One of the students asked, is it stronger, or is it better to write about someone else's religion as a non-practitioner, as an outsider? Do you get more of the truth with that way of doing it, or is it better to write about it as a person who is a practitioner of that faith? And I don't think there's any clear answer. I think it's more of the person doing the witnessing, the journalists themselves, and it depends. But I think that is a temptation or a danger or a potential pitfall, I guess, when writing about a subject who you're very drawn to. So I think that's where the role of the editor really comes in, and trusted readers, and people who can say, I think you're not being critical enough here. You need to, apply a little more critical lens to your subject. But having that kind of editorial, someone over your shoulder, I think is what I really depend on if I'm getting too enamored with my subject, I think. Yeah.
Just to add to the point, following on what we said at lunch, I suggested that I think certain Catholic journalists that I know were slow to respond to signs of the clerical sexual abuse crisis because of being Catholic, because of our esteem for the clergy. And then in that case, it took a fair amount of adversary journalism from people who were not Catholics to bring witness that people in my tradition, our tradition, were not ourselves capable of, alas. And so sometimes really being on the outside is vital.
Yeah.
David?
I'm David Hollenbach. David Hollenbach. I'm professor here at Georgetown. And one question that perplexes, or not perplexes me, but I'd like to hear your reflection on your attraction to the monastic life. And you mentioned Paul raised about the silence and the interiority and so forth, which is very beautiful in most of the monastic traditions, but also in the Roman Catholic tradition, in most monastic traditions, there's beautiful chant and the singing of the office. And I've always found, if I'm at a Benedictine or a Trappist monastery for a short time, which is only a short time for me, that is a very attractive reality. It's very beautiful. And so there's a kind of beauty involved in what's going on in certain elements of the monastic life. And I wonder how that fits with the silence that's also there. And there's an interesting blend of beauty and silence, it seems to me, in monasticism. And I'm wondering whether you share that view that I just mentioned, and if so, how you would explain whether it's something like that is attractive to you.
No, that's a great point. And I think you're absolutely right. The balance of the beauty and the silence is perhaps when you have the silence, it makes the times of singing or speech even more powerful. Maybe that's one way I've come to think of it. Whereas in our day-to-day lives, we don't have the silence. I think that's the piece that I found missing. We have the beauty in our museums, going to concerts, cultural life, especially in a place like DC, is full of all kinds of beauty and things to look at and listen to. I think it's the silence that's often missing from our lives, and that was a lot of what I found when I went to monasteries, is just how much time there is in solitude and just how much time there is in communal silence. And so it really, it's like when you haven't eaten for 18 hours, you really appreciate that meal. So it's, yeah.
A couple of things in this connection. So Dorothy Day, the Catholic worker foundress, before undertaking a fast, she would listen to an Italian opera to sate the senses. And then in your piece, The Priest in the Trees, there's a remarkable account of how the sermon is undertaken in this forest church. It's apposite. So could you explain, spell out that for us as a way to kind of amplify your answer to David's question?
Yeah, so I wrote about this guy, Father Stephen Blackmer, who was a former forest ecologist, trained at the Yale School of Forestry, was one of the leading figures in forest conservation in New England. For 30 years, he helped preserve millions of acres across New England, founded a couple of nonprofits, and was a committed atheist. He had a bumper sticker on his car, some pejorative statement about Christians or religious people, and just the last person in the world who would think of himself as religious. And as I tell the story as I tell in the piece, he was flying over Dublin and looked down and saw a chapel steeple on a chapel in Dublin, and he heard, "You will be a priest." Heard this just not audibly in the plane, but in his head. "You will be a priest." And he thought he was, he sort of brushed it off, but it kept sort of haunting him, this idea that he would become a priest. And about a year later, after this kind of deep existential crisis and all kinds of other events that unfolded, he ended up matriculating at Yale Divinity School, and 3 years later was minted as an Episcopal priest. But his church was not a church with walls. It was a 106-acre tract of hardwoods in in New Hampshire. And the Church of the Woods, it's called. And Reverend Blackmer holds what would be a recognizably Episcopal worship service, but they just do it outdoors, rain or shine, and they have a maple stump where they serve communion. And in lieu of a sermon, to your question, Paul, he sends people out to walk in the woods and listen to the silence, listen to the voice of creation, he would say. Listen to God's voice coming through the trees, through the mushrooms, through whatever creatures you might encounter. And so that's his church now that he's started, and it's been going for 6 or 7 years. And again, the emphasis on silence, the emphasis on getting outside of the four walls, and in his case, really the emphasis on connecting deeply with creation in a time when the earth is in crisis, in a time of climate change. That was all very much part of his particular ethos.
So silence isn't, in this case, and this is the kind of point that Martin would make again and again, it's not silence per se, silence so that other registers can be heard, whether it's the register of interiority or the register of the sound of creation. So I'm just trying to speak to your point about the dynamic of silence together with richly sensual music that exists in the monastic experience, because they all seem to connect up with each other. Other questions? Yes, right in the front. Oh, I don't care who goes first.
Okay, sure.
Jacob?
So my name is Jacob. I'm a student here, and I'm curious, as a student who isn't being given the budget for a trip recreation, or has a pre-existing relationship with monasteries or anything like that, and maybe earlier in your career, how did you find these points of access to still be writing about things that are high stakes and matter without maybe the level of connections or funding and stuff that you would have now?
Yeah, no, great question. Yeah, I think you can find stories that matter wherever you live. I don't think it's a matter of having to travel. I think maybe I caught the travel bug early on. Maybe it was my parents taking me to Nigeria, and living out my childhood there. But I do have that kind of itch that needs to be scratched in terms of traveling, and so I think that's part of what's driven my curiosity and a desire to just encounter other cultures, other kinds of people very different from myself. But you can do that at home, and I think that's where it whether it's journalism or writing a personal essay, right? I think what drives both and what drives good writing is your own curiosity as a writer. And so if there's something you're really passionate about, a topic that sort of connects to something going on in the world, that's a great place to start, and doing it at home. But I think if you have the curiosity, that's what drives good narrative.
You had also gotten started with was it nonprofit or working as an election monitor? That's how you led. Yeah, so I mean, you weren't funded by a magazine when you wrote that first piece. You were doing some sort of other work, right?
Yeah. So for many years, my writing was I was just doing it as part of whatever else I was doing. And so for a number of years, it was working with different nonprofits. I worked in Chiapas, Mexico as a human rights observer. I helped start this little community farm in North Carolina and was a kind of farmer-in-chief of this community farm for a while, and I wrote about that. So I think the things that you're already interested in and doing in your life, if you want to write journalism or a personal essay or even fiction, let it come out of your own life, because there's all kinds of stories all around you. I think it's what are you really passionate about sharing? What is it that you want to witness unfolding that you can then share with the reader?
Hi, I'm Lisa Director Davis. I'm the program director for the John Main Center. And I also went to St. John's, so it was nice to hear a little bit more about that. But I was just thinking about you as a writer and as a spiritual seeker, and how you've navigated the experiences of loneliness and the experience of solitude in these environments where you've experienced silence. How silence has impacted your experience of loneliness or formed your sense of solitude, and the relationship between the two. And then maybe a second question that goes along with that is, as a writer, coming out of that, do you have a sense of urgency to maybe use your writing as a point of, or as a way to communicate invitation to the reader to explore that, but maybe even as a commentator to that we as a society need, ways to explore, the differences between the painfulness of loneliness, but maybe some of the beauties of solitude, that they're not necessarily the same. I don't know if that question makes sense. So.
Yeah, no, that distinction between loneliness and solitude is something that I explore in this piece. I keep gesturing to this chair in front of me because that's where I'm looking at one of the Harper's copies. But yeah, I write in the piece about experiencing that early experience of loneliness as a child in this missionary boarding school, and how through contemplative practice I was able to I learned how to transform loneliness into solitude. And solitude is very different than loneliness. And loneliness is a yearning for other people, for connection that doesn't exist, right? Whereas solitude I think of as an intentional withdrawal to be by oneself in a way that heightens communion with others. And I even say in the piece something like solitude begets solidarity. And I think by being in solitude and actually practicing that for certain moments of the day or a week or however long you choose to do that, it heightens your connection to humanity and to the living world if you're outside. I think that does that as well. And I think because we're so bombarded by stimuli in our culture, it's just with our phones, and I'm as addicted as anyone to the little oracle that I stare into. But to willingly separate oneself from that and go into an environment in which solitude is welcomed, like a monastery, for example, there's something really powerful that comes out of that, and it transcends loneliness, and it teaches you, I think, how, when you are alone, to not be yearning for some distraction so that you're no longer alone, which is a lot of what social media is designed to do. It's designed to eliminate the need for solitude, right? But when you're practicing solitude, as the monastic traditions of all different faiths have done, you're brought into a wider communion, and I think it's a shift in outlook in a way. Yeah, but that's a great question.
I think it was the critic Alfred Kazin who said that Faulkner made oratory out of solitude. And that it's a beautiful, I'm not sure quite what it means, but it's really beautiful. So there's a bunch of, I want to thank so many people who had a role in this. And I'm going to do that, but then I'm just going to put one piece of wisdom out of Barry Lopez's mouth on stage for you to respond to before we go to the reception. Thank you to our collaborators with the Pulitzer Center, John and Kem Sawyer, Ann Peters, and Holly Rosewood. Thank you to Professor Rebecca Cinderbrand with the journalism program, and also her colleague my colleague, Ann Oldenburg. Thank you to the colleagues from the Berkeley Center who work on communications and events, Amy Vandervliet, Imogen Johnson, Shimen Tong, Siobhan Cooney, and Ryan Craig, who's the director of student programs and who really liaised with the Pulitzer Center and took a substantial role in organizing this. Thanks to you all, and thanks to you all for coming. Just to point things back toward Witness as we adjourn, you wrote about Barry Lopez, the strong mystical writer on the environment, shortly before he died, and you spent some time with him at his house in Oregon. We writers are given our yearning and our wounds for a reason, I understood Barry to mean. Our task is to write a story that will be of service, to write from a place of moral responsibility. We must attend to that yearning, or it will destroy us. In 50 words or less, what did he mean? And then we'll go.
Yeah. Well, as I was describing my my writerly questions, and Barry and I were sitting at the dinner table at his house in Oregon. I'd come to interview him for the Sun magazine, and spent about 3 days with him. And he told me about a quote from, I think, the Gospel of Thomas, something like, if you bring forth what is within you, you will be saved, but if you do not bring forth what is within you, you will be destroyed, or something to that effect. Do you remember that line from the Gospel of Thomas?
I don't know the apocryphal Gospels.
That line that I'm talking about? Yeah, okay. Anyway, the sense of, if you have a deep yearning within you, you have to channel that somehow, right? And I've taken that advice both, I've taken that to heart both in my own sort of contemplative practice, but also as a writer and as a journalist, to really go after those stories that I care deeply about. And Barry did that over a lifetime of 50 years. He died 2 years ago of prostate cancer, but lived a long, amazing life of storytelling. And I think that's been a model for me of really going after that, rather than sort of tamping down your yearning or channeling it into alcohol or television or any of the number of distractions we can channel that yearning to really funnel that and let it come out on the page. I think that's been my desire. Yeah.
Amen to that. Thank you so much. There's a reception outside. So glad.